Our next guest is Alex Axinte, an architect and living and working in Bucharest, who in 2006 co-founded Studio Basar, an architecture studio, but also a special a practice for the production of public and community space that was finalist of European Prize for Public Space in 2014. Currently, Alex is a PhD student and general training assistant at the Sheffield School of Architecture, working as an independent researcher from an intermediary position between applied research, participatory design, and civic engagement.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. For having me. The PhD is finished, thank God. In the meantime, and I'm not teaching at Sheffield anymore, I'm just based in Bucharest, but I'm going to discuss about one of the, let's say, reasons of the PhD, Open Garage project, which is a research and activation project, but it was also my main case study of practice-based research. I was looking at commons and commoning, but not from, let's say, an Ostromian perspective of common pool resources, but rather in a more to the latent form of commons that Massimo De Angelis or Anna Thing is speaking about. But before to speak about the project, I will look a bit of the context. Next slide, please. Of collective housing and the socialist modernist legacy. Next. The socialist city in Romania is really much deals with the center and periphery kind of contradiction, as you have in the case of Bucharest, like half of the city didn't have any running water, 1/4 didn't have electricity, 3/4 was just substandard construction, and 85% was just one-level housing. This is in the 50s, so Bucharest was needed a socialist reconstruction after the war, but not because of the war damage, but because of the high inequality that was inherited. Next. So these kind of new towns were starting to appear around the city, like Drumul Tabereri neighborhood, which was started in the 50s, actually by very young architects in their almost 30s that received the brief. They didn't know that it's going to be built, so they did it really properly. Eventually, it started to be built from the 60s and finished even late in 80s. Next. It was a highly urban and civic emancipation for a huge number of population, as you saw in the beginning. Next slide. And it promoted equitable living, housing as a right, not an economic merit, as we saw yesterday in the keynote speaker. Next. But some of the neighborhoods were, let's say, more, they were not all working class neighborhoods as we know. There was, for example, in Drumul Tabereri, a high personal property, as it was called. So it was, for example, a more middle class kind of environment. Next slide. So if we speak about Drumul Tabereri, next, the generous planning was so, let's say, appreciated that it became like a showcase of the regime. You see here Fidel visiting, or Gorbachev was there. Next time, next slide. The public equipments were very well done, especially in Drumul Tabereri, not like other neighborhoods that didn't have any, or their public equipments finished in time. Next slide. Especially the green infrastructure was very generous. Next slide. Next slide, not all, let's say, the infrastructure was built in time, especially behind the big boulevards. Like we saw in the documentary movies about Regimental, about the mud that you saw, that was also happening in Drumul Tabereri. So a lot of constructions, and especially the green layouts, were postponed or cancelled or delayed. Next time. Slide. And then a lot of these problems were solved by people. They took a shovel in the hand and they start to, take care of the in-between spaces. Next slide. And gardening was also prized by the socialist regime. It was promoting this socialist citizenship, like productive consumers. The state is giving you a house. Now you have to also take part in maintaining it, like you have a Trabant and then a box tool that you have to repair it. It was also a bit of participation and voluntary narrative. Next slide. And this is formal practices kind of supported by the socialist state, but also in inheriting some of the skills and knowledge of the previous garden city of Bucharest, really bloomed in the 80s. It was also the food crisis, so the kind of was like a complementary to the economic context. Next slide. And then we come to today, so how this inheritance was transformed today. We have this radical privatization. You have here the cars, but it's just a metaphor for all the other privatizations of public and community infrastructure that was fragmented and closed and disappeared. Next slide. And also the civilization paradigm, it's this main, another declination of the anti-communist discourse. For example, in the green spaces, the informal gardens, which are perceived as invasive and uncivilized, are replaced with what you see here, this green carpet of unparticipative and unsustainable landscape. Next slide. And in this context, the legacy of belonging and care of these practices somehow still survives. Next slide. And then in this context, Open Garage project happened. Next. It's a former garage at the ground floor of a collective housing neighborhood that was transformed into a small, actually it was a tailor before, that I was rented for part of my scholarship. Next slide. And I was used at the beginning as my workplace. Next. But then I started, for example, the first thing I started was a library for kids and teenagers, and then with the kids that were coming to the library doing some sort of workshops, and then in the parallel the research was advancing, so the space became a bit of the gallery of the research, exhibiting some of the products. Next slide. What went very well was the exhibition on recent memory and all these stories and quotes and pictures from early dwellers that we call the pioneers, so the first one who settled here, and they had these foundational stories about the neighborhood. Next slide. Then we get out of the garage in the vicinity, and we organize all these kinds of. We also have this pop-up pavilion from previous projects. We try to get to other, let's say, groups and communities. Next slide. And so we organized different workshops, like gardening workshops or storytelling workshops, but also slowly we opened a school by the garage, like a laboratory of research, so students from landscape and anthropology and sociology study were having their fieldwork around the garage in the district. Next slide. Among the methods were like participant observation, interviews, but also architectural ethnography, so we started to try to understand what are the mechanisms of these latent commons and how they are manifesting, for example, in the use of transforming the garages, because I haven't invented anything. My neighbors were already doing this transformation of garages, and I started to try to map this process and see who are the actors and a bit of material culture. Next slide. How they become really the functions that the neighborhood was needed. Here you have a grocery store. Next slide. Or also the gardens, as we saw in the examples from Tbilisi yesterday. Next slide. That in the pandemic they saw like an awakening, so something that happened in the 80s. It was the memory of the neighborhood kind of resurrected. People needed this to get outdoor, to take care of something, and in these collective housing neighborhoods they also had the space, the skills, and it was like a way of life accepted. So next slide. We identified different manifestations. So for example, this like a showcase kind of window shop, a lot of upcycling. If you look on YouTube, you can learn how to make these suns or swans or whatever from these materials. Next slide. It's also this social place or playgrounds. So for example, again in the pandemic, when the parks were closed, a lot of these gardens saw a resurrection, using this informal kiosk, doing kids parties around the block. Next slide. Or also very heavily planted gardens. Next one. But which also became shelters for animals, so this kind of mutual care of other dwellers, it's also manifested really highly in the neighborhood, like you have here. We call this the Cat's Palace. Next. All this was collected in, let's say, a map, like like the original design of the neighborhood, and now we superimpose these informal uses, and we saw that at the scale of the neighborhood they are quite a lot. So although they are small in scale and they are just marginal and peripheric, but some, if you look at the bigger picture, they have a force of transformation of the whole neighborhood. And this next slide were transformed into different products. So there was the exhibition in the garage, there was the map, there was the student projects, and there's a video on YouTube. So if you go on YouTube channel Open Garage, there is a video there with subtitles that summarize the whole project. The next slide. And want to finish a bit on the question researcher activator. At one moment, one neighbor called me Alex, the neighbor, and then I said, okay, the project is finished. I can just be there by the garage. It was, let's say, more than 2 years journey to get to have this tag. Next slide. But it's also part of the way of life in collective housing neighborhoods, so not to romanticize it too much. So in the left you have one neighbor that brings cookies when we have kids workshop, and another one that throws water when we are too loud. So this is part of, if you lived in a blocks of flats in the eastern part of Europe, maybe you remember. Next slide. A bit of the conclusions, just to finish. And next, so these socialist districts have a right to history and memory. Next one. There is a lot of attachment and belonging to the district of the dwellers themselves that is not really expressed and verbalized. The next. That it's also practiced and transformed also through gardening. So it's not only about stories, but it's also about practices. Next one. Also going by the garages, taking part in the community with their body. It's a form of socialization. Next slide. There is a high need of education and culture in the proximity that involves participation. Next slide. And devices like the Open Garage prove that they can work as relational instruments between researchers, educators, neighbors, and activists. Next one. And finally, so to conclude this kind of investigation on the commoning, there is a form of discrete commoning that is different than the one that's explicit and organized. There is this discreteness that it's specific to collective housing neighborhoods, and it's assumed as a way of life by the dwellers. So it's not something that is quite, let's say, activist, but is more silent and quiet, but nevertheless very well, let's say, distributed and articulated. And I would say it's more authentic in this sense. Okay, that's it. Thank you.